I beat this drum often, and honestly most people don't really think this today, but Puroresu isn't exactly a world of sweetness and light. It's hardly a place for the timid. Historically, to get into it, you have to go through a ridiculously intensive dojo system designed to weed out the weak through many hours of training, hideous behaviour from the seniors, the encouragement of toxicity amongst your fellow trainees, and endless bowls of chanko. It's a whole other world, one that's almost prison-esque in how it replaces everyday life with absolute routine, it pours damage upon a person's psyche, and it can certainly produce some, well, unsavoury characters. So I thought that a few vids might be on order, something to revisit every so often, a series of videos about people in Puro who could be described, bluntly, as pricks. And someone like Koji Kitao is an ideal place for us to start from. Firstly, a lot of his antics are more amusingly ridiculous and stupid than they are flat out freaking horrible, so we're not traipsing through a whole load of misery from the get-go. And secondly, well, he is a product of Sumo. The Sumo path was the first and main path into Puroresu for many years, it's where the whole aforementioned dojo system comes from and all that, so there's quite a lot of similarities in how you're expected to carry yourself, especially when you're a top guy. And this is something Kitao failed at, both in sumo and wrestling, although there is a little bit of redemption here as well. Anyway, let's get going by looking at old Koji and the incidents that made him something of a prick, and certainly one of the dumbest wrestlers kicking around in Puro's history. Obviously, we have to venture into the world of sumo. This is where the prickishness took hold, where the man made his name, and where he had a rather sudden and spectacular downfall. Koji Kitao, as Futahaguro, is infamous for being the only Yokozuna ranked Rikishi to have never won a single basho, and for his scandalous dismissal. Whenever a Rikishi, particularly one of a high rank, ends up disgracing themselves in one way or another, they'll usually end up getting compared to Futahaguro. Anyway, let's get back to the beginning, before all that. Koji Kitao entered sumo at the age of 15, going into the Tatsunami stable, and he had a pretty comfortable upbringing. Indeed, some would say that he was rather spoiled, and that this contributed to his somewhat negative attitude, particularly when it comes to training. Seemingly, any time he was subjected to any kind of strictness in training, he'd complain loudly, talk up various injuries, flounce off, even threaten to quit completely. He was pretty high maintenance. With that said, he certainly had a lot of raw talent and natural ability, as well as being monstrously powerful. From his debut in 1979 at the age of 16, it took him a little over 5 years to make it to the Mikuchi top division, getting there in September of 1984. Not the fastest ever or anything like that, but not bad going. And this period of time between making Mikuchi and becoming Yokozuna definitely saw him produce his best sumo, winning lots of awards and defeating Yokozunas like Kitanumi, Takana Sato, and the dominant Chiyono Fuji. He started in 1986 as an Ozeki, the rank below Yokozuna, and again, his results continued to be pretty damn good. The only thing that was missing for all of this was an actual Yusho, a tournament win in the Mikuchi division. He'd come damn close, mind. In the May 1986 Hatsu Basho, he finished 12-3, making him the runner-up to Chiyono Fuji, who defeated him in the decisive final match. In the July 1986 Nagoya Basho, he did even better. His record was 14-1, matching Chiyono Fuji all the way, and this time beating him in the final regular tournament match to force a playoff, one that he would lose. And it is these two performances in particular that caused the association to deliberate over his promotion to Yokozuna. Now, traditionally, an Ozeki needs to win 2 consecutive bashos to be promoted to the top rank. However, it is also possible to be promoted through equivalent performance, meaning that his performance over the previous couple of bashos had been equal to that of the winner, which in this case you could argue for. This was also a time when the association were a little desperate to have a younger Yokozuna alongside Chiyono Fuji who could possibly challenge his absolute dominance of the sport, and Kitao seemed like the best prospect. The main obstacles to his promotion were his aforementioned lack of a Yusho and his conduct, which, to be honest, hadn't exactly improved as he'd gone up the ranks. He was still high maintenance, still one to complain about any sort of strict training and so on, only now that he was at such a high level, he wasn't really getting disciplined at all. In fact, whenever he did act out, the Tatsunami Oyakata, or stable master, Haguro Yama, was more likely to discipline the person tasked with training him for not being able to control him, rather than Kitao himself. It was hoped that with the promotion to Yokozuna, the 23-year-old Kitao would mature somewhat and take on the onerous duties associated with the top position, becoming an example for others to follow. And so, eventually, the association voted 6-1 in favour of Koji Kitao becoming the 60th Yokozuna, and he would take on the new Shikona, or ring name, of Futahaguro. And then, well, it didn't exactly take long for things to go pear-shaped. The association's hope that Futahaguro's conduct would improve on becoming Yokozuna didn't happen, and more than that, his performance level just suddenly seemed to fall off a cliff. He withdrew from his first basho as Yokozuna with a 3-3 record after complaining of food poisoning, which was questioned somewhat by the media, and he withdrew from another basho in March of 1987 with knee pain. Again, the media were incredulous. He did manage to get to another playoff against Chiyonafuji in January 1987, losing once again, but other results such as an 8-7 record in the July 1987 Nagoya Basho were particularly poor, the sort that you just don't expect from a Yokozuna, and the media treated him as someone who had simply been promoted just so that Chiyonafuji wasn't the only top-ranked Rikishi out there. The November 1987 Kyushu Basho, which would prove to be his final one, did at least produce a better result. He ended that one with a 13-2 record, winning 13 in a row but losing the final 2 bouts, including the last to Chiyonafuji, who ran the whole table and finished 15-0. While he was still young and the association still hoped that he would improve, he most certainly wasn't on the level of Chiyonafuji, and wasn't exactly thought of as being better than any of the Ezekis. And then, well, just like that, it was all over. Futahaguro's behaviour was still generally appalling, particularly when it came to his underlings. On one occasion, he shot a valet with an air pistol, causing all but one of his junior stable members to temporarily leave a tournament in protest. And the actual incident which caused things to all come to a head? Well, that happened over chanko. Chanko, in case you don't know, is the big pot of stew filled with chicken, fish, tofu, and other assorted high-protein foods that Rikishis eat exclusively and in massive portions. And Futahaguro was deeply unhappy with the quality of the chanko at the Tatsunami stable. So unhappy, in fact, that he blew up at one junior over his seasoning of the chanko, apparently going so far as to strike him. In late December, this led to an argument between Futahaguro and stablemaster Haguro Yama. Things got very heated, and according to the stablemaster, Futahaguro had punched the stablemaster's wife as he stormed out. Now, it would be more accurate to say that there had been pushing and shoving between groups, with some others getting caught in the crossfire, but the punch was what was reported. He wasn't actually outright expelled for this, but his stablemaster tendered Futahaguro's resignation to the association, without his consent, which is a bit odd, it must be said. And in actual fact, a lot of the stablemaster's account ended up getting discredited. Haguro Yama himself, years later, and not long after his retirement, was disgraced due to the revealing of his somewhat dodgy financial dealings, and it appears as though he felt he had to remove Futahaguro from his stable as a means of covering up these troubles, which Futahaguro himself wasn't privy to. Nowadays it's commonly agreed that his account of Futahaguro's dramatic and scandalous departure was largely made up, or certainly exaggerated, and in the mid-2000s the older and considerably more mellow Koji Kitao made a return to his old stable as something of an unofficial advisor. So this is one thing that should be said, at least. As much as Koji Kitao had a terrible reputation both in sumo and wrestling, and probably deserved to be kicked out for his actions, he did admit to the errors of his ways in his later years, acknowledging that he was a young, spoiled and rather arrogant idiot. Anyway, most people thought it obvious that Koji Kitao, now an ex-Rikishi, would make his way to something like Puroresu, but that didn't happen straight away. Initially, he actually dove a bit into the world of sports commentary, presenting himself as a sports adventurer and having a TV series with this sort of thing, where he went around and, well, tried his hand at different sports. And it's through this where he had a bit of a tryout of wrestling and got his foot in the door at New Japan, training for a couple of months in America in summer 1989 under Lou Thesz before signing a freelancer's deal and making his New Japan debut in February 1990. For New Japan, the potential upside to signing Kitao was huge. He's already a notorious celebrity for a start, but beyond that there's the simple fact that he's freaking billed at 6'7" and well over 300 pounds. That needs to be emphasised. The man was huge, especially for a Japanese person. Not many other Japanese wrestlers reach or better Kitao's height. Off the top of my head, I can only think of Yoshihiro Takayama and Giant Baba. If New Japan could have made things work with Kitao, they could have had a legit massive star on their hands. And no one really talks enough about his first match against Bam Bam Bigelow in the Tokyo Dome, as it was a major deal. The New Japan debut of this former Yokozuna was big news even outside of Japan, and it got an audience of 26 million when it aired on TV a few nights after it happened, the most watched ProRes match in 4 years, since Inoki's bout with Leon Spinks. Indeed, this is actually the biggest match of Bam Bam Bigelow's career, by far, certainly bigger than his Mania match with Lawrence Taylor. All goes well at first. He's got a freaking awesome entrance theme. His entrance gear is cool as hell, and his ring gear is like this sort of twisted tribute to Hulk Hogan, of all things. Nice. Unfortunately, then the bell has to ring, and it becomes clear pretty quickly that Kitao is green as all hell. Bam Bam certainly can't get a good match out of him at all, I'm afraid, and the crowd's loud reactions pretty soon die down. After 10 generally pitiful minutes, Kitao finishes proceedings with a Samoan drop followed by, of all things, the atomic leg drop of doom, just to ram the strange Hogan tribute home. It's not much cop, it must be said. The fans didn't think it was much cop either. Kitao was booed a fair bit on his way out of the arena. Basically, everything went totally fine until, an actual match had to happen. Oh, and also, for context, Kitao's debut was the semi-main of the evening, and it had to follow Vader vs Stan Hansen. Yes, that Vader-Stan Hansen match, the eyeball one. It wasn't long at all before the audience utterly soured on Kitao. His matches were brief and utterly bereft of quality, and soon enough he was basically just generating go-away heat. It wasn't long before other wrestlers soured on him either. Again, he just wouldn't train properly, he was arrogant, and he hardly grabbed even the basics of working. In particular, he didn't know how to sell in any way, shape or form. Hell, he didn't even want to know. Even when someone would try and explain anything to do with selling or psychology or general mat sensibilities to him, he'd just wave it off, saying that surely if he just used all of his strength, he'd just win anyway, because he was better, or words to that effect. Kitao obviously knew best and sod everyone else, or the way that things had been done up to that point. You can also probably guess that this mindset didn't exactly help things whenever he was booked to lose a match. Naturally, he complained about that a hell of a lot. It wasn't long before, again, it all came to a head in New Japan. After he completely screwed up taking a suplex and apparently injured himself, Riki Choshu, head booker, main event star, and a guy who's quite the prick himself, let's be honest, took him to task, trying to make him see some sort of reason, telling him that he couldn't just cry off the moment he got slightly hurt, and that he had to practice if he was going to keep on getting used. There's various ways that a person can take this sort of criticism, of course. You can take it on the chin, perhaps use it to get better. Koji Kitao's choice was to challenge Riki Choshu to a fight, say that Riki was scared of him, and to call him a Korean bastard, going directly at Riki's Zainichi heritage. So, yeah. Between the flat-out racism and offering Choshu out, that was enough for New Japan to terminate his contract on the spot. His career in New Japan lasted all of 5.5 months. Choshu said later that in his view, it didn't matter which company took Kitao on next, he'd cause the same trouble. And, well, he was dead right. Another company would indeed take him on later in 1990, that being the new SWS, Migan Super's big money entry into Puro, headed up by Genichiro Tenryu. Tenryu, himself a former Magashira 1 level Rikishi, tried his best with Kitao, as he often would with fellow ex-sumo players, hoping to make something out of the raw power he had and thinking that his reputation could help make him into a star. But of course, this didn't happen, although we do get his appearance at WrestleMania 7 on March 24th, where he teamed with Tenryu and they defeated the Wayne-in Smash Crush version of Demolition. Barely 2 weeks after his appearance at Mania, he would get the sack again. This time, of course, it was thanks to the infamous match that went completely wrong against John Earthquake Tenta. Quake was booked to win, of course, and Kitao was furious about it. I mean, not only was Tenta a former Rikishi himself, one who'd only spent a relatively short time on the dojo under the name of Kota Tenzan, reaching Makashita level before leaving for pro wrestling, well under Kitao, he also wasn't Japanese. So the very idea of losing to Earthquake was absolute anathema to Kitao, the former Yokozuna, jobbing to someone he clearly felt was utterly beneath him. The funny thing is, what we're seeing here is actually their first match, which happened on March 30th in the Dome at the SWS WWF WrestleFest show. Tenta wins here and Kitao was raging about it, but this match goes off without incident. It's 2 days later in Kobe, where Tenta's booked to win again, where the shit hits the fan and Kitao is even angrier. The first few minutes don't go completely off the rails, even if the action is bad, but then Kitao goes for what is most likely a shoot Kimura, Tenta escapes, and from there, well, we're going cement. Kitao gets into a fighting stance, looking like he's going to try and take Tenta's eyes out, clear arguments are happening, it's a total stalemate, and Kitao ultimately gets DQ'd for striking the ref. At which point, he got on the house mic and called Tenta a Yaocho bastard. Yaocho means match fixing, and it appears as though he also called him the Japanese version of the R word. Hell, he even seemingly thought he'd thrown his own personal pipe bomb, asking the crowd if they thought that his impromptu promo was exciting before leaving. Doesn't appear as though they did. The tumult continued backstage, with further details supplied a long time later by Masakatsu Funaki. Kitao and Tenta were at each other's throats, mostly Kitao going absolutely balmy, and while Kitao was having a massive tantrum, he was reprimanded by the wife of SWS and Megan Super President Masahiro Tanaka for his awful behaviour. Kitao's response? Well, he shouted, "Shut up, old hag," and threw a chair in her direction. Shockingly enough, SWS had no choice whatsoever but to fire him. While Tenryu would bring Kitao back in a couple of years later, in War, and we'll get to that in a bit, he recognised that any attempt to make Kitao something of a star was just doomed to failure, mainly because of his attitude. He'd even whine about long bus journeys, and he just wouldn't take any advice on board, not even from someone as experienced and as decorated as Tenryu. Great Kabuki, who had the book in SWS, was also dismissive, feeling that the idea of bringing Kitao in was just doomed from the start and ultimately being proved right. In his eyes, Kitao simply wasn't a pro wrestler. Koji Kitao wasn't the first former Yokozuna to make his way into pro wrestling by any stretch, but, well, he was certainly the worst, not just through performance, but through attitude. He certainly thought he was a lot better than he actually was, mind, and thought he should be treated accordingly. It is worth looking at how other Yokozunas, or indeed other highly ranked Rikishis, fared in Puro. After all, you may wonder if the case of someone acting like Kitao is a bit more common, if it's someone who's made it all the way to the top or near the top of sumo and is perhaps used to a certain level of treatment. Were there other ex-Yokozunas who had such attitude problems? And the answer is, well, no, not really. The first former Yokozuna to make his way into wrestling was Azuma Fuji, all the way back in 1950s JWA, although his pro wrestling career was so short that it's hard to get much of a grip on how he acted. The ex-Yokozuna who Kitao was most often compared to was Hiroshi Wajima over in All Japan, who competed a couple of years before Kitao's arrival into Puro. Wajima had a strong 7 years at the top of sumo before retiring, leaving sumo altogether a couple of years later due to debts he'd accumulated, and turning to pro wrestling for All Japan. Wajima was pushed heavily due not just to his former status, but with the knowledge that, well, he was nearly in his 40s, and the injuries he'd accumulated as a Rikishi meant that his Puro career wasn't likely to be very long. But still, the media noted that Wajima's conduct in the 2 years or so he spent as part of All Japan was the exact opposite of Kitao's. He didn't have the airs or graces, and he worked his arse off as much as he could. For a more modern example, I would also look to Akebono, one of the biggest stars in sumo's history. As much as Great Bono's in-work does kinda tend to get a bad rap, again, he absolutely worked his arse off. He wasn't above doing anything at all, and he had a great reputation in the locker room, ultimately spending 12 years as a pro wrestler. Tadao Yasuda also may not exactly be the best wrestler in the world, far from it, but while he didn't reach Yokozuna level, he's still one of the highest ranked Rikishis to take on Puro, having previously achieved Konosubi as Takano Fuji. Only the Yokozunas and the Sekiwaki level Rikidozan achieved higher than that. And again, he worked incredibly hard in New Japan. Admittedly, a part of that was down to what happened with Kitao. That whole disaster was not something New Japan wanted to repeat, and when Yasuda started in New Japan, they essentially made him start from scratch. No hype, no celebrity, just another young lion. And Yasuda accepted that. Say what you will about Yasuda's in-ring work, the man was never short of effort, he always wanted to improve, and in the end that paid off. And if you need a mark as to just how bad Koji Kitao was, well, I'm positively talking about Tadao Yasuda in comparison to him. Anyway, after that little diversion, let's get back to Koji Kitao and what he ended up doing next. He found himself in shoot style, working freelance for the UWFi, and well, you probably know what comes next here. The big match on October 23rd, 1992 against Nobuhiko Takada, one that Kitao and his agents had negotiated to be a draw, complete with the usual fun and games of Kitao potentially flouncing out of the whole match at the last minute. Still, he made it out to the ring for a free 5-minute round match against Takada, who had his own thoughts about how the match should go. He communicated those thoughts to Kitao at precisely 46 seconds into the third round by way of an absolute exocet of a roundhouse kick that knocked Koji Kitao the hell out. A famous victory indeed that was a huge boost for Takada. In the aftermath, Kitao pretty much accepted that Takada had utterly outplayed him, which may come as a surprise, but, well, then it's weird. When you look at Koji Kitao before and then directly after October 23rd, 1992, it's almost as if that Nobuhiko Takada roundhouse kick knocked a whole lot of the ego and arrogance out of him, as by and large the Koji Kitao who wrestled afterwards was considerably more cooperative and had a much better attitude than before. Did the complete wanker part of Kitao's brain fly out of his right ear thanks to Takada's kick? Who knows? But it sure was something that humbled the hell out of him. The majority of Kitao's career from there passed without incident largely. As mentioned, Tenryu gave him a second chance, hiring him for War in 1994, and that was where he'd spend the rest of his career. Although there was that one time where in his second match for War, he did perhaps try and get a bit too stiff with Haku, who, again, is a former Rikishi who only reached Makashita rank. Something of a theme there. Anyway, some of Kitao's chops and strikes were perhaps a little too live for Haku's liking, and Kitao very quickly got some receipts, in particular a whopping dropkick to the face. I'm not necessarily sure if this is Kitao trying to be too stiff with Haku and being incredibly stupid, or him just not being very good and being stiff naturally. Things largely went smoothly in the match after that, although this time Koji Kitao was booked to win the match in question. Speaking of which, Koji Kitao and John Tenta would have a rematch in War in late 1996. Again, this rematch and feud, which did allude a fair bit to the incident that happened previously, went largely without incident, even if the actual bout wasn't much cop. Again, and unsurprisingly to be honest, Kitao was booked to win this time. To be honest, you can't really say that this would have been due to Kitao's complaints, as he was a lot higher on the War totem pole than Tenta was, actually one of the biggest faces behind Tenryu himself. The crowd generally liked him by this point. You couldn't ever say that he was good in the ring, not in the slightest, but he had a much better attitude and a more martial arts shoot style thing going on, which worked a lot better for him than trying to wrestle more conventionally. He did quite a bit of stuff outside of wrestling too. He had a role in the film The Quest, acting with Jean-Claude Van Damme, and there's a bit of MMA as well. He lost against Mark Hall at UFC 9 and was on the first ever Pride show. So if you want to see Koji Kitao take on Nathan Jones, of all people, in a quite blatantly worked MMA bout, well, that's a thing you can see thanks to Pride. He even finally got that match with Riki Choshu in the Tokyo Dome in 1995, a one-off return to New Japan with Choshu teaming with Tenryu and Kitao teaming with frickin' Antonio Inoki. Pretty wild stuff, as you can imagine. He could have even featured on All Japan's 1998 Dome show in a match against Akira Taue, yes, another ex-Rikishi, formerly Juryo-ranked Tamakirin, but this didn't happen, and Kitao retired from wrestling and sports later in 1998, largely keeping a low profile and not even really telling his daughter much about his earlier sports exploits. By all accounts, he was a very kind father. And as mentioned, he did keep the odd hand in, having a sort of unofficial return to the sumo world and getting into better books with the association. Sadly, Koji Kitao passed away on February 10th, 2019 at the age of 55, following years of health problems. Kitao's story, beyond the ridiculous stupidity of a lot of his actions, is certainly one of lost potential. Now, usually stories of lost potential revolve around an awful injury, an incident, a tragedy. This one's more about personality. People may wonder why Koji Kitao got the chances he did, but it needs to be stressed that he could have been a massive star. Again, 6'7", 350 pounds. Size matters in Puro, and that's pretty bloody large. He was already a big celebrity, thanks to Sumo, and he was only 24 when he left Sumo, relatively uninjured, despite any complaints he may have made to the contrary. The potential was freaking huge in wrestling, just as it had been for Sumo. Chiona Fuji, the legend, said that if it wasn't for what happened with Futahaguro, he may not have set the marks that he did, such as the 53-match winning streak, or the 1,045 career victories, which were records at the time. He absolutely could have been a great if it wasn't for his utterly honking attitude and his antipathy towards training, which unfortunately then carried over to pro wrestling, although he did eventually see the error of his ways, regretting a lot of his past actions. Ultimately, compared to some of the other characters that have popped up in pro res over the years, he's not exactly amongst the worst. He was mainly a stupid and arrogant young idiot with a very short temper who thought that he knew better than everyone else. There's definitely much more unpleasant incidents and people kicking around, that's for sure. Still, looking at Kitao is somewhat entertaining. What with being objectively the worst Yokozuna in Sumo's history and all of his other antics, he certainly wasn't a boring person to cover, that's for sure. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.